Machiavelli once wrote, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both." I never truly understood what he meant until I was 29 years old, sitting in a sterile conference room in downtown Chicago, getting fired for being too nice to lead effectively. My manager, Rebecca, delivered the news with the kind of clinical detachment that comes from corporate training manuals. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being let go for the exact trait I'd been praised for during my entire career. For 3 years, I'd managed a team of 12 software developers at a mid-sized tech company. I thought leadership meant being everyone's friend, always saying yes to requests, and smoothing over every conflict with compromise. When deadlines slipped, I'd work weekends to cover for underperforming team members. When 2 developers had personality clashes, I'd spend hours mediating instead of making hard decisions. I genuinely believed that if people liked me enough, they'd naturally want to perform better. The wake-up call came during my final performance review. Rebecca pulled up feedback from my team, and I'll never forget her exact words. "They like you, Michael, but they don't respect you." She explained how my developers had been complaining to HR about lack of clear direction, inconsistent standards, and my inability to make tough calls. One developer had even requested a transfer because, as he put it, "Michael's too nice to tell us when we're screwing up." That's when I realized Machiavelli wasn't advocating for cruelty. He was revealing a neurological truth about human behavior. Our brains are wired to follow competence and consistency, not likability. When we respect someone, our mirror neurons automatically make us want to imitate their behaviors. Love is emotional and volatile. Respect is structural and lasting. I'd been trying to lead through the wrong psychological mechanism entirely. After getting fired, I spent 6 months studying leadership psychology and reading everything Machiavelli had written. I learned that being feared doesn't mean being a tyrant. It means being someone whose standards and decisions carry weight. It means people know you'll follow through on both promises and consequences. It means they might not always like your decisions, but they trust your competence enough to follow anyway. My next role was leading a struggling marketing team at a startup in Austin. This time, I implemented what I'd learned. During my first week, I set 3 non-negotiable standards. Deadlines were sacred, quality was measured objectively, and excuses were addressed privately, but never accepted publicly. When Jessica, a talented but chronically late designer, missed her 3rd deadline in 2 weeks, I had a direct conversation with her about expectations and consequences. The transformation was remarkable. Within 60 days, our team's project completion rate increased by 40%. More importantly, team members started seeking my input on decisions and defending our standards to other departments. They'd learned to respect the consistency of my leadership, even when individual decisions weren't popular. Jessica, by the way, became one of our top performers once she understood the boundaries were real. I discovered that respect creates a psychological safety net that love cannot. When people respect your competence, they feel secure following your lead because they trust your judgment. When they only like your personality, they're constantly second-guessing your decisions and testing your boundaries. It's the difference between a foundation built on rock versus sand. The most interesting part was how this change affected my personal relationships too. I stopped being the friend who always said yes to every request, the boyfriend who avoided difficult conversations, the son who never challenged family dynamics. People initially pushed back when I started setting boundaries, but eventually they began treating me with more consideration and seeking my opinion more often. Looking back, that firing was the best thing that ever happened to my career. I learned that being respected for your competence opens doors, that being liked for your personality never could. Respect gets you promoted, gets you better opportunities, and ironically, often leads to genuine affection from people who value strength over softness. What I didn't realize then was that earning respect was just the beginning. Once people start taking you seriously, you face a completely different challenge, knowing when to be present and when to be scarce. That's where the real power dynamics begin, and where most people who master respect end up making their next critical mistake. But that's a story for tomorrow night. Machiavelli understood that scarcity creates value when he wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. I learned this lesson the hard way during my second year at a marketing agency in Portland, where I was desperately trying to prove my worth by being the most vocal person in every meeting, the first to respond to every email, and the guy who always had something to contribute to every conversation. My colleague David, on the other hand, rarely spoke up in our weekly strategy sessions. When he did contribute, though, the entire room would lean forward. His comments were always precise, insightful, and moved the conversation forward in ways that genuinely mattered. I noticed that our creative director, Janet, would often pause the meeting and ask, "David, what's your take on this?" even when he hadn't raised his hand or indicated he wanted to speak. Meanwhile, I was talking constantly, but finding myself increasingly ignored. During one particularly painful meeting, I watched Janet's eyes glaze over as I launched into what I thought was a brilliant analysis of our client's brand positioning. She actually started checking her phone while I was mid-sentence. The contrast was stark and humiliating. David said maybe 3 sentences the entire hour, but those 3 sentences shifted our entire campaign strategy. The turning point came when I overheard Janet talking to our account manager after a client presentation. She said, "When David talks, I know it's worth listening to. When Michael talks, I know he's trying to fill silence." That comment hit me like a physical blow because it was absolutely accurate. I'd become the office noise, not the office expert. My constant chatter had devalued my currency in the attention economy. That weekend, I did something that felt completely unnatural. I decided to experiment with strategic silence. Instead of jumping into every conversation, I started listening first and contributing only when I had something genuinely valuable to add. During our Monday morning brainstorm, I kept my mouth shut for the first 45 minutes, taking notes and really processing what others were saying before formulating my response. When I finally spoke up, it was to point out a critical flaw in our proposed campaign that nobody else had noticed. The flaw would have cost our client approximately $50,000 in wasted ad spend. Janet stopped the entire meeting and said, "That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need more of." The difference in how people responded to me was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, I had their full attention instead of their divided tolerance. Over the next 3 months, I practiced what I started calling strategic scarcity. I stopped responding to emails immediately, instead taking time to craft thoughtful responses that moved projects forward. I quit volunteering for every assignment and became selective about which initiatives I championed. Most importantly, I learned to end conversations while people still wanted to hear more, rather than talking until I'd exhausted their patience. The psychological principle at work here is fascinating. Our brains are programmed to assign higher value to things that are harder to obtain. When someone is always available, always talking, always eager to contribute, we subconsciously categorize them as abundant and therefore less precious. It's the same reason limited edition products command premium prices and exclusive clubs maintain their appeal through selective membership. In our hyper-connected world, where everyone is competing for attention through constant posting, commenting and networking, the person who masters strategic absence gains exponential influence. While others are screaming into the void of social media, the strategically scarce individual makes every appearance count. Their silence creates anticipation, and their words carry weight because they're rare. I started applying this principle beyond work. In social situations, I became the person who listened more than I spoke, who asked thoughtful questions instead of dominating conversations, with personal stories. In romantic relationships, I learned that a little mystery and unpredictability maintains attraction far better than constant availability and predictable responses. People began seeking me out instead of taking my presence for granted. The transformation in my professional life was remarkable. Within 6 months, I was promoted to senior strategist, and Janet specifically cited my thoughtful contribution style as a key factor in the decision. Clients started requesting me for high-stakes presentations because they knew I wouldn't waste their time with filler content. My strategic silence had actually made me more valuable than my previous desperate attempts at constant visibility. But here's what I discovered next. Once you master the art of strategic presence, you face an even more complex challenge. People start paying attention to what you say, which means every word carries weight. That's when I learned that true power isn't just about when to speak. It's about never revealing everything you know. The most dangerous mistake you can make is showing all your cards, even to people who seem trustworthy. That lesson nearly cost me everything. Machiavelli warned us to never reveal completely your intentions, but I thought I was smarter than a 500-year-old Italian philosopher. That arrogance almost destroyed the biggest opportunity of my career when I was 31, working as a product manager for a tech startup in San Francisco. I'd just mastered strategic silence and felt invincible, ready to conquer the world with my newfound wisdom about calculated presence. The opportunity came in the form of a partnership deal with a Fortune 500 company that could have transformed our small startup into a major player overnight. During the initial meeting with their business development team, I was so excited about finally being heard and respected that I made a catastrophic mistake. I told them everything. I laid out our entire 3-year roadmap, revealed our user acquisition costs, shared our revenue projections, and even mentioned which competitors we were most worried about. My CEO, Amanda, sat there with an increasingly tight expression as I enthusiastically answered every question they threw at me. I thought I was being transparent and building trust by sharing our complete strategic vision. The meeting felt fantastic. They seemed genuinely impressed by our technology and excited about the potential partnership. We left that glass-walled conference room in downtown San Francisco feeling like we'd just sealed the deal of a lifetime. 3 weeks later, we discovered they'd taken our roadmap and pitched it internally as their own innovation strategy. They'd used our user acquisition data to approach our competitors with better terms than we could offer. Worst of all, they'd shared our revenue projections with a mutual investor who then used that information to lowball us during our next funding round. My openness had handed them every weapon they needed to either acquire us cheaply or simply outmaneuver us in the market. Amanda called me into her office on a grey Thursday morning, and her first words were, "Michael, you gave them our entire playbook in one meeting." She wasn't angry. She was disappointed, which somehow felt worse. She explained something I'd never considered. Information asymmetry is power, and I'd voluntarily eliminated our advantage by revealing everything we knew while learning almost nothing about their true intentions or internal constraints. That's when I understood what Machiavelli really meant about concealing intentions. It's not about being deceptive or dishonest, it's about strategic revelation. You share information in layers, revealing just enough to advance the conversation while maintaining your positional advantage. Every piece of information you share should serve a specific purpose and move you closer to your objective without compromising future negotiations. I started studying how successful negotiators manage information flow, and I discovered they operate like skilled poker players. They reveal their hand gradually, watching for reactions, gathering intelligence about the other party's priorities and constraints before showing more cards. The key is maintaining what I learned to call productive ambiguity, being clear about your value proposition while remaining mysterious about your methods, timeline, and true bottom line. My next major opportunity came 6 months later when we pitched to a different potential partner. This time, I prepared by creating 3 layers of information: public knowledge that anyone could discover through research, strategic insights that demonstrated our expertise without revealing our secrets, and confidential details that would only be shared after they'd committed to serious negotiations with proper legal protections in place. During that second pitch, I answered their questions with questions. When they asked about our user acquisition costs, I responded, "What metrics are most important for evaluating partnership potential in your experience?" When they inquired about our competitive landscape, I said, "Which market dynamics concern you most when considering partnerships with companies our size?" I was gathering intelligence while appearing cooperative and engaged. The difference was remarkable. Instead of them extracting value from us, we created a collaborative dynamic where both sides were strategically sharing information to mutual benefit. They respected our boundaries and began sharing their own strategic priorities, internal timelines, and budget constraints. The negotiation felt like a chess match between equals rather than an interrogation of a willing victim. That partnership deal closed successfully 4 months later, and it eventually led to our acquisition by the same Fortune 500 company for 8 times our initial valuation. Amanda specifically credited my evolved negotiation style during my exit interview, noting that I'd learned to build trust through competence rather than transparency. The irony wasn't lost on me. By revealing less, I'd actually created more trust and better outcomes for everyone involved. Looking back, I realized that strategic information management isn't about keeping secrets for the sake of secrecy. It's about understanding that every relationship has a natural rhythm of revelation, and rushing that process serves no one well. Whether you're negotiating a business deal, building a romantic relationship, or even having difficult conversations with family members, the principle remains the same. Reveal yourself in layers and let others do the same. But mastering information control is just the beginning of real strategic thinking. Once you understand how to manage what you reveal about yourself, you face an entirely different challenge: deciding who deserves access to your time, energy, and expertise. That's where most people make their next critical error. They think strategic thinking is about being clever with information, when it's actually about being selective with relationships. The real power comes from understanding who to invest in. Machiavelli knew that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, but he also understood something deeper about human psychology, that people feel compelled to repay favors, even when they don't consciously realize it. I discovered this principle accidentally during my first year as a freelance consultant in Denver, when I was desperately trying to build a network from scratch after leaving corporate life at 33. My approach was all wrong initially. I'd show up to networking events with a pocket full of business cards and a head full of desperation, essentially begging people to remember me when they needed consulting services. I'd corner successful entrepreneurs at coffee shops and pitch my services like a door-to-door salesman. The results were predictably terrible. Lots of polite, will keep you in mind conversations that led absolutely nowhere. Everything changed when I met Sarah, a marketing director at a mid-sized software company, during a particularly awkward networking mixer at a downtown hotel. Instead of pitching my services, I listened to her complain about struggling to find qualified graphic designers for an upcoming product launch. I happened to know 3 excellent freelance designers from my previous corporate job, so I offered to make introductions with no strings attached. I spent my own time that weekend reaching out to those designers, explaining Sarah's project requirements, and facilitating introductions between all parties. I didn't ask for anything in return, didn't mention my own services, and didn't even hint that I expected future business. I just solved a problem she was facing, using knowledge and connections I already possessed. The whole process took me maybe 2 hours total, but it saved her weeks of searching and interviewing. 2 months later, Sarah called me out of the blue. Her company was launching a new enterprise software product and needed someone to conduct market research and competitive analysis, exactly my area of expertise. She didn't even ask for a proposal or interview other consultants. She simply said, "Michael, you helped me when you didn't have to, and I trust your judgment. Can you handle this project?" That single contract was worth $15,000 and led to 3 more projects over the following year. That experience taught me something profound about human psychology that most people completely misunderstand. The brain is hardwired for reciprocity. When someone helps us, we feel an almost physical discomfort until we've returned the favor. It's not conscious calculation, it's neurological programming that evolved to help humans survive in tribal societies where mutual aid was essential for group survival. But here's the crucial part. Most people get wrong. The favor has to be genuine, valuable, and given without obvious expectation of return. People can smell transactional favors from miles away, and those actually create resentment rather than gratitude. The key is to help others in areas where you have natural advantages, knowledge, connections, skills, or resources that are easy for you to share but valuable for them to receive. I started systematically applying this principle across all my professional relationships. When I met a startup founder struggling with hiring, I shared a recruiting framework I'd developed at my previous company. When a fellow consultant mentioned difficulty with client presentations, I sent her my template library that had taken me years to perfect. When someone posted on LinkedIn about needing market data, I'd share relevant research I'd already completed for other clients. The transformation was remarkable. Within 18 months, I had more consulting opportunities than I could handle, all coming through referrals from people I'd helped previously. My business grew not because I'd become a better salesperson, but because I'd learned to plant seeds of reciprocity that bloomed into ongoing business relationships. People started introducing me at events as the guy who really knows how to help people succeed. What fascinated me most was how this principle extended beyond professional networking. In personal relationships, I found that small, thoughtful gestures, remembering someone's important presentation and checking in afterwards, sending articles related to their hobbies, connecting them with others who shared their interests, created much stronger bonds than expensive gifts or grand gestures that felt forced or calculated. The psychological mechanism at work is essentially social debt creation, but in the most positive way possible. When you solve someone's problem using your natural advantages, they carry a mental note of that help. They don't consciously think, "I owe Michael a favor," but when opportunities arise that could benefit you, your name surfaces in their mind first. You've earned mindshare through utility, not through self-promotion. I realized that most people approach relationship building backwards. They try to extract value before creating it, essentially asking for withdrawals from accounts where they've made no deposits. The strategic reciprocity approach flips this dynamic. You become the person who adds value to others' lives consistently, which naturally positions you as someone worth investing in when opportunities arise. But as my consulting practice grew and my network expanded, I discovered that success creates its own problems. The better you become at strategic reciprocity, the more people want access to your time, energy, and expertise. That's when I learned that being helpful to everyone is actually a path to being useful to no one. True strategic thinking requires knowing not just how to give, but more importantly, who deserves your investment. The real skill isn't in building relationships, it's in choosing which relationships are worth building. Machiavelli observed that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, meaning people value what they can see over what actually exists. I learned this brutal truth when I was 34, watching my brilliant colleague Marcus get passed over for a promotion that went to someone half as competent, but twice as visible. That moment shattered my naive belief that good work automatically speaks for itself in the professional world. Marcus was hands down the most talented data analyst I'd ever worked with. He could spot patterns in data sets that others missed entirely, build predictive models that saved our company millions, and solve complex technical problems that left the rest of us scratching our heads. But Marcus worked quietly in his corner office, rarely spoke up in meetings, and never bothered documenting his achievements in ways that leadership could easily understand or remember. Meanwhile, Jennifer from our marketing team had mastered something that Marcus completely ignored: the art of making her contributions visible and memorable. She created detailed case studies for every successful campaign, sent weekly summary emails highlighting key wins, and always found ways to present her work in terms of business impact rather than technical details. When promotion time came around, the executive team could immediately list Jennifer's contributions, but struggled to recall Marcus's specific achievements. The decision meeting happened in a glass conference room where I could see our VP of Operations, Linda, literally reading from Jennifer's self-created impact summary while discussing candidates. She had charts showing revenue increases, client retention improvements, and cost savings directly attributed to Jennifer's campaigns. When Marcus's name came up, Linda paused and said, "He's obviously talented, but I can't quite put my finger on his specific contributions to our bottom line this year." That's when I realized that competence without visibility is professionally invisible. Our brains use mental shortcuts called heuristics to make decisions quickly, and one of the most powerful heuristics is what psychologists call the availability bias. We judge importance based on how easily we can recall. Examples: Marcus's brilliance was hidden in spreadsheets and databases, while Jennifer's competence was packaged in memorable stories and measurable outcomes. I decided to become Marcus's unofficial marketing manager. I started documenting his analytical breakthroughs, translating his technical insights into business language, and finding opportunities to highlight his contributions during team meetings. I created what I called Marcus Moments, brief presentations where I'd share how his analysis had prevented costly mistakes or identified profitable opportunities that others had missed. The transformation was remarkable. Within 3 months, Linda started specifically asking for Marcus's input on strategic decisions. She began forwarding his reports to the executive team with notes like, "This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking that drives our competitive advantage." Marcus himself started recognizing the value of visibility and began volunteering to present his findings directly to leadership rather than just submitting written reports. 6 months later, when the next promotion cycle arrived, Marcus not only got the advancement he deserved, but was also asked to head up our new predictive analytics department. Linda specifically mentioned that his combination of technical excellence and strategic communication made him the obvious choice. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus's competence hadn't changed at all, but its visibility had transformed completely. This experience taught me that talent without demonstration is like having money in a bank account that nobody knows exists. You might be wealthy on paper, but you can't leverage that wealth for opportunities, investments, or growth. In our attention-scarce professional environment, the ability to make your competence visible isn't vanity. It's a survival skill that determines whether your career advances or stagnates. I started applying this principle to my own consulting practice. Instead of just delivering excellent work and hoping clients would notice, I began creating case studies that told the story of each project's impact. I documented before and after metrics, captured client testimonials about specific outcomes, and developed a portfolio that translated my problem-solving abilities into visual proof of value creation. The change in how potential clients responded to my pitches was dramatic. Instead of trying to convince them I was competent, I could show them exactly how my competence had generated measurable results for similar businesses. My conversion rate from initial meeting to signed contract improved by nearly 60%, not because my skills had improved, but because my ability to demonstrate those skills had evolved dramatically. I also learned that visible competence creates a psychological phenomenon called the halo effect. When people can clearly see your excellence in one area, they automatically assume you're excellent in related areas too. Clients started asking me to handle projects outside my core expertise, confident that someone who delivered such impressive results in market research could probably excel at strategic planning or competitive analysis as well. But here's what I discovered as my reputation for competence grew. Visibility is a double-edged sword. The same mechanisms that amplify your successes will also magnify your failures if you're not careful about managing information flow. Once people start paying attention to everything you do, every mistake becomes more consequential, and every word carries more weight than you might intend. That's when I learned that true strategic thinking isn't just about making your competence visible. It's about controlling which aspects of your capabilities and knowledge become visible and to whom. Machiavelli understood that knowledge is power long before Francis Bacon made the phrase famous, but I discovered that information becomes dangerous when you can't control who has access to it. This nearly cost me everything when I was 35, working as director of business development for a medical device startup in Austin. My fatal mistake wasn't trusting the wrong person. It was failing to understand that every conversation creates potential leverage for others. The crisis began innocently enough during a Thursday afternoon coffee meeting with my friend David, who worked at a venture capital firm downtown. We'd known each other since business school, and I'd always valued his insights about industry trends and investment patterns. During our conversation at a crowded cafe near the Capitol building, David mentioned that his firm was actively looking for opportunities in the medical device space, particularly companies with strong intellectual property portfolios. I was excited about my company's recent breakthrough in minimally invasive surgical robotics, so I shared what I thought were general details about our technology platform and market positioning. I mentioned our patent applications, discussed our clinical trial results, and even revealed our projected timeline for FDA approval. David seemed genuinely interested and asked thoughtful questions about our competitive advantages and manufacturing scalability. What I didn't know was that David's firm had been in preliminary discussions with our primary competitor for weeks, considering a major investment that would fund an aggressive market expansion. Every detail I'd shared about our strategic plans, technological capabilities, and regulatory timeline was intelligence that could be used to evaluate whether our competitor represented a better investment opportunity than partnership possibilities with us. 3 weeks later, our CEO Lisa called an emergency leadership meeting in our small conference room. She'd just learned that our main competitor had received a $25 million investment round and was accelerating their product development timeline to beat us to market. Worse, they seemed to have inside knowledge about our patent strategy and were filing competing applications that could potentially block our intellectual property claims. The devastating realization hit me during Lisa's presentation when she mentioned that the competing investment had come from David's firm. I sat there feeling physically sick as I understood how my casual conversation had potentially undermined months of strategic work. I'd given them detailed intelligence about our capabilities, timeline, and market approach without gaining any valuable information in return. My transparency had armed a competitor while exposing our vulnerabilities. Lisa pulled me aside after the meeting, and her question was direct. "Michael, have you discussed our development plans with anyone outside the company recently?" When I explained my conversation with David, her expression shifted from confusion to profound disappointment. She said, "You gave our competitors' investors a complete assessment of our strategic position. They used your insights to evaluate whether we were a threat worth neutralizing." That evening, I sat in my apartment overlooking Lady Bird Lake, replaying every detail of my conversation with David and trying to understand where I'd gone wrong. The problem wasn't that David had betrayed our friendship. He'd simply done his job as a venture capitalist by gathering market intelligence. My mistake was assuming that relationships create information boundaries that don't actually exist in professional contexts. I realized that information exists in different categories that require different levels of protection. Public information includes anything discoverable through research or industry publications. Private information involves internal data that isn't strategically sensitive. Confidential information could impact competitive positioning if disclosed, and secret information could fundamentally damage the organization if it reached the wrong people. The key insight was learning to provide context-appropriate information that serves the conversation without compromising strategic advantages. Instead of sharing specific patent details, I could have discussed general industry trends. Rather than revealing our regulatory timeline, I could have explored broader market dynamics. People can contribute valuable insights without needing access to sensitive strategic intelligence. I spent the following months rebuilding Lisa's trust by demonstrating much more careful information management. I learned to prepare different versions of updates and presentations, each containing only details appropriate for specific audiences. Board members received comprehensive strategic context, while department heads got information focused on their operational responsibilities without broader competitive intelligence. This approach actually improved the quality of my strategic work because it forced me to become more precise about what information was truly necessary for each business relationship. I could still build meaningful professional connections and gather valuable market insights, but I no longer shared more context than was required for productive conversations. Over time, I discovered that strategic information management isn't about being secretive or paranoid. It's about understanding that every piece of intelligence you share creates potential influence for others. The goal is maintaining information asymmetry that preserves your competitive advantages while still building the relationships necessary for business success. But as I became more sophisticated about controlling information flow, I faced an entirely different challenge. Once you understand how to protect strategic intelligence, you must decide who deserves access to your most valuable resource of all: your time, attention, and expertise. That's where most people make their next critical mistake. The hardest lesson isn't about managing what you know, it's about choosing who gets to benefit from your knowledge. Machiavelli wrote that, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend," but he also understood that your allies define your reputation more powerfully than your own actions ever could. I learned this lesson at 36, when I made the mistake of accepting every networking invitation, joining every professional group, and saying yes to every collaboration request that came my way. My desperation to build connections nearly destroyed the credibility I'd spent years developing. The wake-up call came during a high-stakes client presentation in Seattle, where I was pitching a strategic consulting contract to the leadership team of a growing software company. Everything was going perfectly until their CEO, Richard, paused mid-conversation and asked, "Aren't you the consultant who worked with TechFlow Solutions last year?" I confirmed that I had, thinking this would demonstrate my experience in their industry sector. Richard's expression immediately shifted. He explained that TechFlow had recently been investigated for fraudulent billing practices and questionable data privacy policies. Several of their executives were facing federal charges, and the company was toxic within their professional community. My association with TechFlow, which I'd accepted purely because they could pay my fees, had branded me as someone with questionable judgment about business partnerships. The meeting ended 15 minutes later with polite but firm rejections. Richard was diplomatic, but his message was clear. They couldn't risk their reputation by hiring someone associated with a scandal-plagued company. I'd lost a six-figure consulting contract because I'd failed to properly evaluate the long-term reputational cost of a short-term financial opportunity. My indiscriminate networking approach had finally caught up with me. That evening, sitting in a hotel bar overlooking Elliott Bay, I realized I'd been thinking about professional relationships completely backwards. Instead of focusing on quantity, how many people I could connect with, how many projects I could take on, how many groups I could join, I should have been obsessing over quality and strategic alignment. Every professional association creates implicit endorsement that reflects on your brand and credibility. I spent the next month conducting what I called a relationship audit of my professional network. I categorized every connection based on three criteria: their reputation within the industry, their alignment with my values and standards, and their potential to either elevate or damage my professional standing. The results were sobering. Nearly 40% of my associations were either neutral or potentially harmful to my long-term career goals. The most painful part was acknowledging that some relationships needed to end entirely. I stopped responding to collaboration requests from companies with questionable business practices. I resigned from professional organizations that had become more about social networking than substantive industry advancement. I declined speaking opportunities at conferences that lacked credibility or attracted the wrong type of audience for my brand positioning. This selective approach initially felt like I was limiting my opportunities, but the opposite proved true within 6 months. The quality of inbound requests improved dramatically because I was no longer associated with low-standards organizations or problematic companies. Prospective clients started mentioning other well-regarded companies I'd worked with as reasons for wanting to hire me. My reputation had become an asset instead of a liability. I discovered that strategic relationship building operates like compound interest. The right associations create exponential returns over time, while the wrong associations create exponential damage. That's much harder to repair. When you're selective about partnerships, you signal that your time and expertise have genuine value. When you accept every opportunity, you communicate that your standards are negotiable and your judgment is questionable. The psychological principle at work is what researchers call association transfer. People automatically assign characteristics of your known associates to your personal brand. If you're connected with high-integrity, successful organizations, those qualities transfer to how people perceive your competence and character. If you're associated with problematic companies, those negative attributes attach to your reputation regardless of your personal conduct. I started applying this principle beyond professional networking to personal relationships as well. I became more intentional about which social circles I participated in, which events I attended, and which people I spent significant time with. Not because I was being elitist, but because I'd learned that associations are investments in your future opportunities, and your relationships should align with your aspirations. The transformation was remarkable. Within 18 months, I was receiving referrals from clients I deeply respected, invitations to speak at prestigious industry conferences, and partnership opportunities with companies that shared my values and standards. My income increased by over 60%, but more importantly, my work became more meaningful, because I was collaborating with people who elevated my thinking and challenged me to perform at higher levels. But here's what I discovered as my network became more strategic and selective. Quality relationships require much more sophisticated management than quantity relationships. When every connection matters significantly, you can't afford to make timing mistakes or miscalculate when to engage versus when to step back. That's when I learned that association is just the beginning of a strategic relationship management. The real skill lies in understanding the rhythm of influence, knowing exactly when to be present, when to be absent, and when to make your move. Machiavelli knew that there is a time for war and a time for peace. Understanding that even perfect strategies fail with imperfect timing. I learned this brutal truth at 37 when I destroyed what could have been the most important business relationship of my career by making the right request at catastrophically wrong moment. My timing was so bad that it took me 3 years to repair the damage I caused in a single conversation. The relationship was with Catherine, the CEO of a rapidly growing fintech startup in San Francisco. We'd built genuine mutual respect over 18 months through industry conferences, strategic discussions, and collaborative problem-solving sessions. She'd mentioned multiple times that she wanted to bring me on as a strategic advisor when her company reached their next growth milestone. Everything was progressing perfectly toward a partnership that could have transformed my consulting practice. Then, Catherine's company hit a major crisis. A security breach exposed customer financial data, regulatory investigations were launched, and their primary investor threatened to pull funding unless immediate changes were made to their leadership structure. Catherine was working 18-hour days, managing crisis communications, legal challenges, and internal reorganization while trying to preserve what remained of their reputation and customer base. That's when I made my catastrophic error in judgment. During what I thought was a routine coffee meeting at a cafe near her office, I decided this would be the perfect time to formalize our advisory relationship. I reasoned that she needed experienced guidance more than ever, and I could provide immediate value during their most challenging period. I prepared a detailed proposal outlining how my strategic consulting could help navigate their crisis. Catherine listened politely as I presented my ideas for reputation management, stakeholder communication, and organizational restructuring. But as I transitioned into discussing advisory, their terms and compensation structure, her expression shifted from professional courtesy to barely contained anger. She set down her coffee cup and said, "Michael, are you seriously trying to sell me consulting services while my company is burning down around me?" The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. I realized I'd just made myself look like a vulture circling wounded prey, someone who saw opportunity in her crisis rather than offering genuine support. Catherine stood up, gathered her papers, and said with cold professionalism, "I thought you understood the difference between partnership and opportunism." I was clearly mistaken. She left me sitting alone at that cafe table, knowing I'd just destroyed a relationship that had taken years to build. That evening, I sat in my apartment trying to understand where I'd gone so wrong. The content of my proposal was solid, and my intentions were genuinely helpful. But my timing revealed something ugly about my priorities that I hadn't recognized myself. By pitching business during her crisis, I'd communicated that I viewed her problems as my opportunities rather than caring about her success, independent of how it might benefit me. I learned that timing isn't just about calendar coordination, it's about emotional and psychological readiness. Catherine wasn't in a mental space to evaluate new business partnerships. She was in survival mode, focused entirely on protecting her company and employees. My proposal, regardless of its merit, forced her to consider my interests when she had bandwidth only for immediate crisis management. I'd essentially asked her to think about my career advancement while hers was in jeopardy. The psychological principle I'd violated is what researchers call cognitive load theory. People have limited mental processing capacity, especially during high-stress situations. When someone's cognitive resources are consumed by crisis management, they can't properly evaluate complex proposals or make strategic decisions about new relationships. They need support, not additional decisions to consider. I spent the following months studying the psychology of timing and decision-making. I learned that successful timing requires reading not just external circumstances, but internal emotional states. The best time to make requests is when people feel successful, optimistic, and have mental space to consider new possibilities. The worst time is during stress, uncertainty, or when they're dealing with immediate threats to their security or reputation. It took me 8 months before I reached out to Catherine again, and even then I didn't mention business. I simply sent a brief note acknowledging her company's recovery and expressing genuine admiration for how she'd handled the crisis. I offered no services, made no requests, and suggested no meetings. I just wanted her to know that someone in her professional network was paying attention to her success without expecting anything in return. 6 months later, Catherine called me unexpectedly. Her company had not only recovered, but had grown stronger through the crisis, and she was ready to expand her advisory board. She said, "Michael, I've been thinking about our conversation last year, and I realize you were trying to help during a time when I couldn't appreciate it. I'd like to revisit that advisory discussion if you're still interested." That advisory relationship eventually led to 3 successful strategic partnerships and referrals worth over $200,000. But here's what I discovered about mastering timing. It's not enough to wait for the right moment. You also need to control how you're perceived during that waiting period. People are constantly forming judgments about your character, competence, and intentions based on how you present yourself in various situations. One poorly timed action can undermine years of careful relationship building, but consistent demonstration of good judgment creates compound credibility over time. The most sophisticated timing skill isn't knowing when to act. It's knowing how to shape the narrative about who you are while you're waiting for the perfect moment to make your move. Machiavelli understood that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. But I never grasped the full weight of that wisdom until a single photograph nearly destroyed my reputation at 38. The image was taken at a corporate party in Miami, and within 24 hours, it had cost me 3 client contracts and put my entire consulting practice in jeopardy. I learned that perception isn't just reality, it's the only reality that matters in professional contexts. The photograph showed me laughing and holding a drink at what appeared to be a wild party, surrounded by people who looked intoxicated and unprofessional. What the image didn't capture was the context. I was at a legitimate industry conference networking event. The drink in my hand was club soda, and I was actually having a serious conversation about market trends with a potential client. But context doesn't matter when a single frame tells a different story to thousands of people on social media. The crisis began on Monday morning when I received a concerned call from Janet, my biggest client and CEO of a conservative financial services firm. She'd seen the photograph shared on LinkedIn by someone at the conference, and it had been accompanied by a caption joking about consultants who know how to party. Janet's company had strict policies about professional conduct, and she was under pressure from her board to distance themselves from any consultants whose behavior might reflect poorly on their brand. Within hours, 2 other clients had called with similar concerns. They weren't accusing me of misconduct, but they needed to protect their own reputations by avoiding association with someone whose public image suggested poor judgment or unprofessional behavior. The most painful call came from Robert, a client I'd worked with for 3 years, who said, "Michael, I know you're a solid professional, but this photo makes it look like you prioritize partying over business. I can't risk that perception affecting our company's image. That's when I realized I'd been thinking about professional image management completely backwards. I'd assumed that as long as my actual behavior was appropriate, my reputation would take care of itself. But in our social media-driven world, perception is shaped more by captured moments and shared narratives than by consistent professional conduct over time. One poorly timed photograph had more impact on my reputation than years of excellent work performance. I spent that entire week in damage control mode, reaching out to everyone who'd been at the event to provide context about the photograph. I drafted a professional statement explaining the situation without sounding defensive or making excuses. Most importantly, I began developing what I call a narrative insurance policy, a systematic approach to managing how my professional activities could be perceived by others, especially when captured in photographs or social media posts. The key insight was understanding that every public moment is a potential brand statement, whether you intend it or not. At professional events, I started being much more conscious of my positioning, facial expressions, and what might be captured in background shots taken by others. I learned to consider not just what I was doing, but how those activities might appear to someone who didn't understand the full context of the situation. I also discovered that proactive image management is far more effective than reactive damage control. Instead of waiting for problems to arise, I began creating positive content that reinforced my professional brand identity. I started sharing insights from industry conferences, posting thoughtful analysis of market trends, and documenting my strategic work in ways that demonstrated competence and professionalism. This created a buffer of positive impressions that could withstand occasional misunderstandings. Over the following months, I rebuilt my reputation through consistent demonstration of professional excellence, rather than through explanations or justifications about past misperceptions. I focused on creating new evidence of my competence and character, instead of trying to convince people that previous evidence had been misleading. The strategy worked. Within 6 months, I'd not only recovered my lost clients, but had attracted new opportunities from people who'd observed my professional response to the crisis. The psychological principle at work is what researchers call the picture superiority effect. Visual information is processed faster and remembered longer than textual or verbal information. A single photograph creates instant impressions that can override years of accumulated knowledge about someone's character and competence. This means visual moments carry disproportionate weight in how others perceive your professional identity. I learned that strategic image management isn't about being fake or calculating. It's about being intentional regarding which authentic aspects of yourself become visible to professional audiences. Everyone has multiple dimensions to their personality, but not every dimension needs to be displayed in every context. Professional settings require emphasis on competence, reliability, and judgment, while personal settings allow for more casual or playful expressions. This experience taught me that reputation management is ultimately about narrative control. People create stories about who you are based on limited data points, and those stories influence their willingness to trust you with opportunities, referrals, and partnerships. By being strategic about which data points you provide, you can guide the narrative construction process without being dishonest about your authentic self. But as I became more sophisticated about managing my professional image, I discovered that visibility creates its own challenges. The more people pay attention to your brand, the more opportunities arise to say yes to every request, invitation, and collaboration. That's when I learned that image management without selectivity leads to brand dilution and strategic confusion. The real test of professional maturity isn't building a strong image. It's maintaining that image while saying no to opportunities that don't align with your strategic direction. Machiavelli understood that scarcity creates value, but I spent most of my career proving the opposite by saying yes to every opportunity that crossed my path. At 39, I was busier than I'd ever been, working with 15 different clients across 6 industries and making less money than I had 3 years earlier with half the workload. My desperation to please everyone had turned me into a commodity instead of a premium service provider. The breaking point came during a particularly insane week in November when I was simultaneously managing a market research project for a healthcare startup, developing a competitive analysis for a retail chain, creating a strategic plan for a non-profit organization, and preparing 3 different presentations for completely unrelated industries. I was working 18-hour days, producing mediocre work for all clients, and feeling like I was drowning in commitments I'd made to avoid disappointing anyone. That Thursday afternoon, I received what should have been exciting news: a referral for a high-value strategic consulting contract with a Fortune 500 technology company. The project was exactly the type of work I wanted to be doing: complex, well-compensated, and prestigious. But when I looked at my calendar and project commitments, I realized I had absolutely no capacity to deliver the quality of work that would justify their investment or enhance my reputation. I sat in my home office in Portland, staring at my overflowing task list, and finally understood what I'd been doing wrong. By accepting every project regardless of fit, timeline, or strategic value, I'd trained the market to see me as always available and therefore not particularly valuable. Premium service providers are selective about their clients because scarcity signals quality, while constant availability suggests desperation or mediocrity. That evening, I made one of the most difficult decisions of my consulting career. I called the Fortune 500 company and declined their project. I explained that my current commitments wouldn't allow me to deliver the level of strategic thinking their challenge deserved, and I recommended 2 other consultants who could provide immediate availability. The silence on the other end of the call felt eternal, and I was convinced I'd just made a catastrophic career mistake. 3 weeks later, the same executive called me back. He said, "Michael, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I'm impressed that you turned down a lucrative project because you couldn't deliver your best work." That kind of integrity and self-awareness is exactly what we need for our strategic initiatives. Would you be available to discuss a different project with a more flexible timeline? This second project was worth 40% more than the original and led to an ongoing advisory relationship. That experience taught me that no is the most underutilized tool in professional strategy. When you decline opportunities that don't align with your capabilities or values, you communicate several powerful messages simultaneously. You have standards, you're confident in your worth, you prioritize quality over quantity, and you're strategic about how you invest your time and energy. All of these qualities make you more attractive to high-value clients. I started implementing what I call strategic scarcity across my entire consulting practice. I raised my rates by 30% and stopped accepting projects that didn't meet specific criteria. They had to align with my core expertise, offer learning opportunities that advanced my strategic goals, come from clients I genuinely respected, and provide adequate time for excellent execution. This meant turning down approximately 60% of inbound opportunities. The results were remarkable. My revenue increased by 50% within 6 months, even though I was working with fewer clients and fewer total hours. More importantly, the quality of my work improved dramatically because I could focus my energy on delivering exceptional results for carefully chosen projects. Clients started viewing me as a premium, strategic resource, rather than a general-purpose consultant who was always available for any type of work. The psychological principle behind this transformation is what economists call price-quality inference. People automatically assume that expensive or hard-to-obtain services are superior to cheap or readily available alternatives. When you make yourself scarce through selective availability, potential clients infer that your scarcity is due to high demand created by superior quality. This creates a virtuous cycle where selectivity increases perceived value, which justifies higher rates, which enables even greater selectivity. I discovered that strategic no extends far beyond project selection into every aspect of professional relationship management. I became more selective about networking events, speaking opportunities, social commitments, and even casual coffee meetings. By protecting my time and energy for activities that aligned with my strategic objectives, I had more capacity to excel in areas that truly mattered for my long-term career development. The most interesting psychological effect was how saying no changed the way people approached me with opportunities. Instead of casual requests or last-minute projects, I started receiving more thoughtful inquiries from people who'd done their homework about my expertise and were prepared to discuss meaningful strategic challenges. My selectivity had trained the market to bring me higher quality opportunities that deserved serious consideration. But as I became more successful at strategic scarcity, I faced an entirely different challenge. When you've built a reputation for excellence and selectivity, people expect you to maintain those standards consistently. One poorly executed project or strategic mistake can damage your premium positioning much more severely than similar errors would affect someone positioned as a general-purpose service provider. That's when I learned that scarcity without consistent excellence is just arrogance. The real power comes from understanding how to deliver exceptional results under pressure, especially when those results will determine whether your carefully constructed reputation continues to grow or begins to crumble. Machiavelli wrote that injuries ought to be done all at one time, so that being tasted less, they offend less. But Marcus Aurelius taught me something deeper. The best revenge is not to be like your enemy. At 40, I faced the ultimate test of this wisdom when my business partner of 4 years systematically betrayed our partnership while I was dealing with a family medical crisis. What I learned about strategic response changed not only my approach to professional conflicts, but my entire understanding of power itself. The betrayal began subtly while I was spending weeks in Houston caring for my father during his cancer treatment. My partner James started scheduling client meetings without including me, gradually positioning himself as the primary contact for our most valuable accounts. When I returned to our Denver office after 6 weeks away, I discovered he'd convinced 3 major clients to sign exclusive contracts with him personally, effectively cutting me out of relationships I'd spent years developing. The most painful discovery was that James had been documenting every strategic conversation we'd had over the previous 2 years, building a case that I was an unreliable partner who was frequently absent from important business decisions. He'd used my temporary absence during a family crisis to paint a narrative of professional negligence, undermining not just our partnership, but my reputation within our shared professional network. My initial reaction was pure rage. I wanted to expose his deception publicly, file legal action to recover my share of the business, and make sure everyone in our industry knew exactly what kind of person James was. I spent sleepless nights crafting emails that would destroy his reputation, researching litigation options that would force him to return what he'd stolen, and planning a campaign to warn every potential client about his unethical practices. But before sending those devastating emails, I found myself remembering a conversation with my mentor, Sarah, about the difference between emotional reactions and strategic responses. She'd once told me, when someone betrays you, they're expecting you to become smaller, angrier, and more like them. The ultimate victory is becoming bigger, stronger, and more successful than you were before they hurt you. That's when I realized that James had given me something unexpectedly valuable: complete clarity about what I wanted to build independently. For years, I'd been compromising my strategic vision to accommodate his more conventional approach to consulting. His betrayal forced me to confront the question I'd been avoiding. What would my practice look like if I could design it entirely around my strengths and values without having to consider someone else's limitations? Instead of fighting James for control of our existing business, I started building something entirely new. I reached out to former clients who'd specifically requested my expertise, explained that I was launching an independent practice focused exclusively on strategic transformation projects, and offered to continue our work together under this new arrangement. My approach was professional, focused on future value rather than past grievances. The response was remarkable. Within 3 months, I'd rebuilt my client base with engagements that were more aligned with my expertise and more profitable than anything our partnership had generated. More importantly, several clients mentioned that they'd been hoping to work with me independently because they'd noticed a difference in quality when I was directly involved versus when James was managing projects. 6 months later, I learned that James was struggling to deliver the same level of strategic insight that clients had expected from our partnership. Without access to my analytical frameworks and strategic methodologies, he was essentially a relationship manager trying to perform complex strategic consulting. Two of the clients he'd stolen had terminated their contracts and were inquiring about working with me directly. The most satisfying moment came when James reached out to me, ostensibly to clear the air, but actually to propose that we collaborate on a major project he'd been offered, but couldn't handle independently. I declined politely, explaining that my practice was focused on exclusive long-term strategic partnerships that required complete trust and alignment. I didn't mention his betrayal explicitly, but the message was clear. He'd burned the bridge and I'd moved to better territory. This experience taught me that strategic justice isn't about punishing people who wrong you. It's about using their actions as motivation to build something stronger than what you had before. When someone betrays you, they're usually revealing their own limitations and insecurities. Your response should demonstrate that their behavior says more about their character than yours, and that their actions have ultimately served your longer-term interests. The psychological principle at work is what researchers call post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people emerge from difficult experiences stronger, wiser and more resilient than they were before the trauma occurred. Instead of being diminished by James's betrayal, I'd used it as a catalyst for building the practice I'd always wanted, but had been too comfortable to pursue while our partnership was functioning adequately. I learned that true power isn't the ability to destroy people who hurt you. It's the capacity to transcend their actions entirely and create success that makes their betrayal irrelevant. When you respond to betrayal by building something better, you demonstrate a level of strategic thinking and emotional maturity that actually enhances your reputation rather than damaging it through association with petty conflicts. But as I built my independent practice and established myself as a premium strategic consultant, I discovered that success creates its own vulnerabilities. The higher your professional profile rises, the more people pay attention to how you handle challenges, setbacks, and competition. That's when I learned that strategic justice is just the beginning of truly sophisticated power management. The real test comes when you have to decide what kind of legacy you want to build with the influence you've earned. Machiavelli's final wisdom was that a prince ought to have no other aim or thought nor select anything else for his study than war and its rules and discipline. But at 41, I've learned something he couldn't have foreseen in 16th century Italy. The ultimate war isn't against external enemies, it's against your own impulse to use power for temporary advantages instead of lasting impact. True power isn't about defeating others. It's about building systems that create value long after you're gone. This revelation came during a moment of professional triumph that felt strangely hollow. I was standing in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Seattle, having just signed the largest consulting contract of my career with a technology company worth $3 billion. The CEO had chosen my firm over McKinsey and BCG, specifically citing my reputation for strategic insight and ethical leadership. By every external measure, I had achieved everything I'd worked toward for 15 years. But as I watched the city lights flicker on below, I realized I felt more exhausted than exhilarated. I'd spent so much energy learning how to accumulate power, earning respect, building influence, managing relationships, controlling information, that I'd never seriously considered what I wanted to accomplish with that power once I had it. I was strategically successful, but purposefully adrift, like someone who'd mastered chess without deciding what game they actually wanted to play. That evening, I called my mentor, Sarah, now in her 70s and retired from active consulting, but still one of the sharpest strategic minds I'd ever encountered. I described my professional success and personal confusion, expecting her to congratulate me on the contract. Instead, she asked a question that changed my entire perspective. Michael, when you're gone, what will exist because you were here that wouldn't have existed otherwise? Her question forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I'd become incredibly skilled at extracting value from business relationships, but I hadn't created anything that would outlast my direct involvement. I was a highly effective consultant who solved problems for companies, but I wasn't building anything sustainable or meaningful beyond generating revenue for myself. My power was entirely dependent on my personal presence and energy. Over the following months, I started studying leaders whose influence had transcended their individual careers. What I discovered was that sustainable power comes from creating systems, developing people, and establishing principles that continue generating value independent of your ongoing involvement. Walt Disney didn't just build a company, he created a culture of creativity that still produces innovation decades after his death. Warren Buffett didn't just accumulate wealth, he developed investment principles and organizational structures that will preserve and grow capital for generations. I began redesigning my consulting practice around this insight. Instead of just solving immediate strategic problems for clients, I started focusing on transfers of knowledge, development of internal capabilities, and creation of decision-making frameworks that would serve organizations long after our engagement ended. I was essentially teaching myself out of jobs, but the paradox was that this approach made me more valuable, not less. The transformation was remarkable. Clients started engaging me for longer-term strategic partnerships rather than project-based consulting because they understood I was invested in their sustainable success rather than just their immediate challenges. My revenue increased significantly, but more importantly, I began receiving feedback that felt genuinely meaningful. Former clients telling me how frameworks I'd developed were still guiding their strategic decisions years later. I also started investing time in developing other consultants, particularly those early in their careers who reminded me of myself 15 years ago. Not as competitors to be eliminated, but as professionals who could extend the impact of strategic thinking far beyond what I could accomplish individually. I began sharing methodologies, introducing promising consultants to potential clients, and creating opportunities for collaboration rather than just competition. The most unexpected outcome was how this shift affected my relationship with power itself. When your goal is building something that lasts beyond your direct involvement, you naturally become more collaborative, more generous with knowledge, and more focused on creating value for others. The Machiavellian tactics I'd learned, strategic silence, information control, selective alliances, remained useful tools, but they served a different purpose, protecting and advancing initiatives that benefited entire networks, rather than just advancing my individual interests. I realized that Machiavelli's teachings had prepared me to acquire power, but they hadn't taught me what to do with power once I had it. The strategies that help you gain influence are different from the strategies that help you use influence responsibly. Getting power requires focusing on your own advancement. Using power well requires focusing on others' development and long-term systemic improvement. Now, when I make strategic decisions, I ask myself Sarah's question: what will exist because I was here that wouldn't have existed otherwise? The answer guides everything from client selection to pricing strategies to partnership opportunities. I'm not just building a consulting practice. I'm developing an approach to strategic thinking that can be learned, applied, and passed on by others who share similar values and aspirations. This is what I've learned about true power after 15 years of studying Machiavelli and applying his wisdom. The ultimate victory isn't defeating enemies or accumulating advantages. It's creating enough value for enough people that your influence continues growing even when you're not actively exercising it. When you've built systems that serve others' success, those people become invested in preserving and extending your impact rather than competing against it. Tonight, as you consider these 12 lessons we've shared together, remember that strategic thinking is ultimately about choice. You can use these insights to advance your individual interests at others' expense, or you can use them to build something that elevates everyone involved. The techniques are the same, but the outcomes are dramatically different. Choose wisely because the world is watching, and your legacy is being written by the decisions you make tomorrow.